Welcome to The Future Work, the series where we're trying to figure out what can be done now to ensure that all independent workers thrive in the years ahead. I'm Pete Lyden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company that's driving the series, and we're doing this in partnership with Intuit. And today we actually have someone from Intuit, Cassie Divine, who is the head of their in the small business unit. Basically, it's the self-employed unit that really deals with all the kinds of folks we've been dealing with in this series. People who are contract workers, gig workers, temporary people, and just one-man show or one-person shows for the self-employed. And so welcome. Thanks
Thank you.
for having here.
Great to be here.
So talk a little bit, give us a little sense of when you talk about the self-employed unit, what does that encompass from your way of thinking about it within Intuit, basically?
Yeah. Well, it encompasses lots of people who work for themselves, and a number of the groups you mentioned, people who are independent contractors, working gig jobs, maybe part-time or full-time, and a number of people who have been in traditional roles freelancing, photographers, writers, designers, content writers, I mean, all kinds of people who can work for themselves, oftentimes with lots of different customers or clients.
So Intuit, for folks that don't really know what Intuit really does, it's essentially been around for, well, to give a little sense of what you do. Basically, you are essentially providing the software that people can actually do taxes, can do their kind of business backends, and that works for both large organizations, small organizations, and now one-people bands or something. Is that right?
Yeah, and most of our focus is on one-people bands or small people bands in terms of small business. Intuit started more than 35 years ago at Scott Cook's kitchen table, and he watched his wife struggle to balance the family checkbook, and he said there's got to be a better way. And that gave birth to Quicken, and then quickly we got into creating QuickBooks. We acquired a company that made software, and that is now TurboTax. And our focus has always been on consumers and small businesses. And in recent years, we've gotten really focused on a group that really sits nestled in between them, which are people working for themselves, or what we call the self-employed.
Interesting. So how recently has that been? I mean, since when did the organization start morphing around this category of independent workers?
Yeah. Independent workers or freelancers have been using Intuit products for a very long time. It wasn't until probably 5 years ago that we really noticed we were either underserving in some cases, think about people using Mint who were creating custom categories to try to explain that they had business expenses, or we were overserving with QuickBooks really built for a small business. And so we understood this was a customer that needed our help probably more than anybody, that we weren't quite building something exclusively for. And so we got started on what Intuit has always done best, which is understanding the unique needs of this customer and then creating something for them. And there are a lot of things that you need if you're working for yourself, but there are 3 very common problems we got focused on right away. One is your expenses are commingled. You know, you have a credit card and a bank account, and you're using it for personal and business. And so untangling that mess, there's work to be done. A second is you get paid gross, often inconsistently. And so that could be a Lyft driver getting paid weekly on the platform. It could be a realtor selling a house 2 times a year. And so getting a big paycheck and then uncovering what are the taxes due, what are the benefits, what are the things I need to reserve to pay myself vacation, for example. It's really hard to understand what you're making and what's safe to spend. And then lastly, I mentioned taxes. Taxes are often an unfamiliar requirement if you're self-employed. The government in most countries here in the US views you as a business. And so now you have quarterly and annual tax deductions that are different than what you knew to be before. And so there's just work figuring out which end is up, and our goal is to help you do that. So we built a product, Quickbooks Self-Employed, specifically for the independent contractor, freelance photographer. We've since developed a TurboTax product for that customer. And so there's a lot to be done to help people who are trying to make sense of it all and figure out how they're doing driving their own business of one, essentially.
So 5 years ago, you felt that need, but from everything we're seeing in this series, this is a space that's growing.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see Intuit seeing this as a strategically, growth space that needs to be served better, or what's the thinking inside the company?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of people working for themselves today. 5 years ago, there were a lot. I mean, this has been a trend really growing over the last 30 years. If you look at both the decline of the traditional safe career job has been going away, and at the same time, technology is making it a lot easier to, pull out your phone and turn on an app and get some work. And so it hasn't been an overnight success, but the numbers are definitely accelerating. 17% of the workforce was self-employed 25 years ago. We believe it's now 36 or more percent, quickly going to be 43%. I mean, I think you could see in the next 5 years, half of people are doing self-employment in some capacity. It might not be full-time, but that's going to be a big shift in the future of work. And we believe there's lots that needs to change. The world is built for the steady paycheck and the 9-to-5 traditional job. And there's a lot that would need to change as we think about how companies serve this customer and recognizing that it's a unique customer that they might be making services for, how government programs get updated for the self-employed, how rigid systems like healthcare or financial services adapt to change. And so we believe in a world that everything is built for the steady paycheck, and that's the last thing we're going to be seeing as we look at the future of work. I think there's a lot that companies and the public sector could do to make it easier if you're working for yourself.
So there's a whole category, as you mentioned, the public sector and getting through legislation and all the different regulations and things, and think about that. So let's though think about the space you guys are in, the tech world. So software is a kind of an interesting, when you take a complex system that essentially a single individual would find it hard to master, software is the classic middle thing that can actually make a very intuitive and kind of simple way to kind of make that complex system work. And so that seems to be where you guys are trying to, that's your space, basically, right? So we'll talk about, for example, QuickBooks Online Self-Employed that you guys were talking about. I mean, that's a situation where just anybody in a very simple job can just walk me through what that does and how that allows that person to not have to bone up on, all these various categories of knowledge.
Yeah. Which there would be a lot. I mean, so our bread and butter is making the complex simple. You think about, we could print out the tax code and stack it behind us, or you could start using something like TurboTax, that guides you through an interview. So that is our bread and butter, is just making the complex simple. If you're self-employed, you have to keep your expenses in terms of understanding what deductions you get at tax time and if you're audited. And Schedule Cs probably have the highest audit risk of anybody, the tax form you file if you're self-employed. So our app does very basic stuff, and you really only need to answer one question. Was it a business expense or personal? And so, for example, you connect your bank account, we're bringing in all your transactions, and you swipe left or right. Was it business or personal? We joked early we were the Tinder for taxes. And what we're doing in the background is building your Schedule C. So we've got the intelligence to say, hey, that was a business expense at a gas station. All you had to say was business. But we know based on the location of the merchant that it's a gas station. We know that that's a vehicle, a gas and fuel expense for your Schedule C. I mean, there's a lot of intelligence behind QuickBooks in terms of how auto-categorizing those expenses, but that's work we do on your behalf. And so you just tell us, was it business or personal? We're building your Schedule C, so at the end of the year, you know what your deductions are, and it's easy to send it to TurboTax or your accountant. Same thing for mileage deductions. Mileage, the IRS in the United States and in many countries pays you money per mile. That's a deduction, but you have to capture 5 pieces of information. Where were you going from? Where are you going to? How long was the drive? What's the deduction? And what was the purpose? And so that's a lot of information you can imagine, especially if you're doing short trips, to try to capture everything. Our app, you turn on auto mileage tracking, it captures every trip, and then same thing, you swipe left or right for personal, and just record, the common reason. Usually it's one of 5 different reasons. They're already in the app, and you can just give us the business expense. And so things like that make it a lot easier than understanding and paying your quarterly taxes at the end of the year, and then invoicing for a number of people, consultants, freelancers. We make getting paid really easy. So you can do simple invoicing and payments in the app as well. But it doesn't do too many things, but takes off a lot of the anxiety and stress and just time that it requires to run your self-employed life. And you've worked for yourself, time is the one thing that you can't get any more of. And so anything that's wasting your time and creating work to manage your finances and expenses rather than spending time on what you love doing or what you would do to earn money, we try to get rid of all of that so you can focus on what matters.
So your plan, so that's totally valuable. I can see that actually, and that's solving these little problems. But then there's a whole nother way, because we've been exploring the future of independent workers and all the missing pieces in their lives compared to the employed lives.
Yep.
So, and my understanding, again, I don't even know the answer to this, but my understanding is, so for example, if an independent person wants to take a loan out or wants to get a mortgage, or you're subject to a whole different set of scrutiny than if you were just a reliable employee getting a paycheck, W-2, boom. So are you guys dealing with that kind of level of stuff too? I mean, or talk to me about those kind of other categories that go beyond the kind of basic reporting stuff.
Well, we definitely hear that as a big pain point from customers all the time. I recently met a freelancer who said that what they tell everybody they need, if you're self-employed and you want to get a mortgage or you want to get a loan, you just need one thing, which is an employed spouse. And it's true. That's a work, I think you said when you're getting your mortgage, what are your last 2 paychecks? People, it's really hard. That's not a problem we can solve except to talk about it a lot. Now, we did create a report in our product that helps you print out a profit and loss. And at one point, I think we called it just, recent income. And we ended up making it more fancy because customers said, I'm printing this out and taking this into the bank. Let's make it sound more official. And it isn't official, but it's a different view of what your income was for the last 4 weeks than 2 pay stubs. So those are areas that we see. We don't necessarily solve them all, but it's one of the reasons that we're working with you to work on how do we change some of these systems that really favor the traditional worker and have them favor and empower the independent worker or the independent entrepreneur.
Are there other categories like that come to mind, like, saving for retirement, healthcare? But talk to me about the ones that you guys are constantly running into that you feel are beyond the scope of what you can do, but you feel you could help champion or something.
Yeah. I'd say we could probably get out a pay stub and go line by line and say all of these things are painful. You don't realize how much is on a pay stub that makes it easy. In some cases,
walk us through that. Talk about that.
Well, so think about setting aside money for a vacation, setting aside sick time. If you get sick and you work for yourself, that's just a day you're not making money. It's not necessarily a day that you get to cash in 8 hours of personal time off. And so it can be really grueling. Retirement, health insurance. And in some cases, there are great programs available, but people don't know about them. So healthcare is a great example. There are a lot of exchanges that you can do great shopping for healthcare and find great plans. Just the government side in California is a great example. It's also a place where you can find out about healthcare subsidies. So a lot of people who are self-employed also qualify for healthcare subsidies, but finding all of the different pieces to bring that all together is hard work. In some cases, we've looked at how can we bring that into our product, and so healthcare is one. We try to capture health expenses differently and educate our customers around where they could maximize them. Retirement's another area. That's one, oftentimes it's just understanding what's out there for you. The Treasury Department in the US had a My IRA that first came out. It was exclusively for people who had an employer. And then they updated it to have My RA. And so if you're an independent person, you can shop for retirement, and it's a great exchange, but a lot of people don't know it's there. That said, I would say if you're self-employed, the biggest pain point isn't what's on that pay stub, it's knowing where that paycheck comes from. Finding work and getting paid for that work is by far the number one pain point. And so retirement and healthcare, all of that is really painful, but it's at the end of the day, you're worried first and foremost, where's my next paycheck going to come from?
Okay, so that's a good way to think about it. So what you've basically said is, okay, there's these categories of pain points that are essentially what happens when you work outside of the W-2 employee kind of status. You've went through a bunch of those. Mm-hmm. There's another one, and that's just benefits and all that pieces that are pretty well understood, I think, by the average people. They get that. But what you're saying, there's this other category that it's like you're constantly looking for a job. Yep. I mean, most people do that once every 5 years or whenever they get a new job. But you're saying, so that, are you hearing that from the folks? Because you guys are unusually tied into all these people, but that's their main worry, concern, problem?
It is, and it is a concern both for people who are struggling to make ends meet. You look at all of the stats that you would see about people having $400 to pay for an emergency expense. Really is painful if you're also on top of that, don't have a guaranteed job to go to the next day. And so you're also trying to increase your income. At the same time, you've got lots of freedom and flexibility, but a lot of people who are self-employed will explain to you, it just sounds like they're constantly in this nonstop hustle to make sure they've got their next job lined up. And that could be, literally the next job, meaning the next day. Definitely a lot of the on-demand apps make that a lot easier. You might have a number of apps that you can be shopping around for work. But I've also heard it from, a top real estate broker at a LA brokerage that, is their top sales performer, but it's not guaranteed. And so even to talk to her, you would hear this, what's my next job going to be? And so different levels of anxiety and pain for different people, but I would say it's the number one is, what is the work going to be and can I count on it? And then also getting paid for that work is part of that, and what you earn for that work is part of that as well.
Meaning, like, worry about getting stiffed by not getting paid or something? What do you mean by that?
It could just be a cash flow issue. There are lots of well-intentioned businesses, I'm sure, that you work with that pay you within 60 days. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so you could imagine you've got lots of bigger clients. That's hard. It's one of the things we focused on as a company as we've tried to really think about what we could do for the self-employed and what we should be advocating for the self-employed. We've also asked ourselves, what could we do differently? And one of the things was our payment terms. We would typically pay a small business or an independent contractor within 45 days. And that's a long time to go if you need that money. And so we've looked at why couldn't we accelerate it and have it be 10 days? And there are a number of companies that it signed on. In the last administration White House, there was a supplier pay initiative that encouraged companies of all sizes to make commitments that the call was to benefit small business, but it really benefits anybody who's working for themselves. And so that's an example of, pain with, we're good for the money, we just weren't prioritizing getting it to you. For others, there are pains around getting paid on time. New York recently passed a Freelancing Isn't Free Act that had different protections for people who had outstanding invoices that favored the independent contractor. But just the matter of managing all the paperwork. If you're a freelance wedding photographer and you're doing a wedding every weekend, maybe two, that's a lot of people to just be chasing down to get payment. And so it might not be stiffing, but just cash flow becomes a challenge.
So are there ways, you've kind of pointed out some legislative ways or regulatory ways to do that, but are there ways, and you mentioned a little bit of your own, but there are ways that could also be done by just evolving the business model or having tech companies kind of just solving that in some way? Is there any thoughts on how that works, kind of?
Yeah, I think it could take lots of forms. I think one of the things I've seen platforms do increasingly, well or poorly, is have great transparency of how they pay fees. How do you earn money on the platform? What's the cut the platform takes? What does that money cover? So some platforms, for example, Winolo being one, where you can do on-demand staffing. There are different protections of workers' comp or other things that could be included. And so I think there are a number of companies doing a good job explaining what's in and what's out when you look at how you'd make money on their platform, which really helps. In most cases, just that visibility and transparency of fee structure and how money is made is great, how money is paid is great, and also visibility and transparency around if you get your money faster, are you incurring higher fees to get that money? And so again, a lot of times people they might be interested in taking it, but I think companies, particularly on-demand and platform companies, can do a really good job being very clear with their customers so they're empowered to make decisions about what work they want to do on the platform and how they get paid.
So you're kind of implying a thing there that maybe we should just be specific about. So what you're saying is some platforms will allow you to get paid earlier, but then they take a larger piece of that from a kind of a financial transaction piece or something.
Yeah, it might be. And in a number of cases, people might pay for that.
Because they'd rather have the money.
But it's just being transparent about what is or isn't included. Same about companies that are matching on demand the type of work. I think Winolo does a great job of matching you to jobs that is also being clear about what you need to be successful and protected in that job. And so just that deeper transparency around what's included so you can understand if it's something that you would be in charge of getting or the company or what licenses might be required. Thumbtack does a great job of that. Just examples. I think those are examples where companies are doing a great job. I think there are also examples where companies want to do more in tech, but they are afraid of worker classification. One of the things we've pushed is that as you think about the advice that your independent contractors need, this would be true of any business. There's a lot of people who are very leery about the type of advice that they might give that it could be seen as training. But there's a lot around financial literacy and tax obligations and compliance that we see as information that wouldn't harm anybody. It stays within the confines of employing an independent contractor, but would be really easy. And so we've pushed, could the government ease up or clarify what the specific, what is in and what is out as you think about the advice you can give your independent contractors?
So that isn't clear right now.
It's not
very
clear.
different. From the federal government or from any government entity?
That's a good question. I think on both. I mean, Steve King from Emergent Research recently gave me a stat that any one person employed in a company, working as an independent contractor, there's local, state, municipal, federal. There's all kinds of regulations, and understanding which ones matter to you. There's a lot, and I think companies right now are erring on the side of being more conservative versus, really giving some of the advice. That's something we've pushed for. So
it's interesting because again in this series we've just been in this. There's always this dance between what do we need from government, what could tech do, what could the workers themselves do. This is one though. It seems like a pretty clear and pretty low-hanging fruit, honestly, just to get clear on what's in and what's out, so that people could then more boldly or more directly address this, as opposed to shying back from any work in that space just because they're afraid of getting reclassified. So this security thing, which is so central, I just want to talk a little bit more about that and then move on to some other issues. But this is the future of work, so we're allowing ourselves to go forward in motion in the coming years and potentially even further than that. This one, at least, just from my point of view, seems to be promising areas that could be solved through technology, for example. And I think what we're watching is a big wave of AI. We got these artificial intelligent assistants who are helping us solve all these little things that you used to have to go do yourself. it seems to me not a long stretch to like have an independent worker with some kind of pretty near term here AI that could actually help book gigs, check out deals, compete, place bids. I mean, any thoughts on that, or is Intuit thinking of that, or is there anything you know about that space?
Yeah. Well, so we agree. Artificial intelligence, machine learning. I mean, one of the great places it could be put to work would be in freeing you up to whether it's booking gigs for you, or we're focused first on reducing work that just manual tasks, administrative tasks you're doing all the time. That's an area where machine learning and artificial intelligence can definitely help. And I think you could imagine an assistant of some kind doing all kinds of things for you. We've got a conversational user interface in our app today that starts with basic questions of how much am I making? How did I do last month? How does that compare? But you could imagine something evolving to do more of the work that you don't value that needs to get done, that is a task a machine could do for you.
So you could ask it like, what are the gigs out there today that are really a good match for my profile, or like, how much should I bid on this thing, or something like that. You're that kind of level of conversation.
A level of, it's not what is done today, but one of the areas where machines can help is unearthing insights we don't have access to do today. What's my most profitable work? Who pays me the fastest? I mean, who pays me, who do I make the most for when you consider how much I work and how quickly they get paid? I mean, there are a number of things that machine learning could definitely help with that we see, and we're starting to push in our own app and starting to see a lot of other platforms push there. That's definitely a rich space. I think there's also an opportunity to just surface everything out there. A lot of times there is something that could help you. There's a better deal on health insurance. There's a better deal on retirement. There's a opportunity. It could be things that people like you are doing to save. There are all kinds of hacks that you could bring in, both community intelligence, software intelligence, that I think a lot of that could be automated in a way to make life easier. So I think that's where we're going to see some of the most exciting innovation in this space.
Is in the AI, kind of this interface idea.
Yeah, and even connections between platforms. A lot of people don't work for one platform, they work for three. Or they work for one platform and then they also have their side business. You think of anything from the Lyft driver who also has a transportation business of their own, to the freelance photographer that is also your accountant. I mean, there's so many opportunities. And so I think not only for one company or one platform to solve it, but what can be solved when there's more connections between the platforms and the work to really create some beautiful digital infrastructure of sorts for the self-employed person. I think there's a lot of opportunity for tech there.
So let's just build on that 1 second. So again, it's like who needs to do what and who can do what without asking permission from other people. So for example, there is a whole, and this is the thing about being in this seat here. I've just been talking to all these people about all the issues around this, and it's just burgeoning all over the place. One of them, though, is the idea of this portable, your portable body of work. So if you're rated 5-star on Uber and you're rated 4-star on Lyft, and how do you go to a third one that combines those things and builds a body of work? Now, some people immediately go, is that a government thing? Is there a way that we force some kind of government, central identity that aggregates these reputations? On the other hand, you could also see that as a tech fix. I mean, there could be a platform of platforms that just is a trusted intermediary between all these platforms or something. I don't know, any thoughts on this idea of like the tech potential solution to that problem you just pointed out there?
I like the idea that companies and tech get together and decide what they want it to be and have the standards and the APIs to make it happen and move forward rather than waiting for government. Because these are challenges right now. I think I like that we're going to have a Treaty of San Francisco event because I believe that there are a number of things where we shouldn't wait for rules. We could all agree there are a set of principles.
Right.
We, for a long time, thought about and are still have been working on, we've called it different things, but think of it as a self-employed manifesto, or at one point we called it a declaration of independence. And one of the things that we could all agree on, and my thought is that it would be, our thought is it would be, are there a set of things that we believe independent workers and self-employed people and independent contractors deserve? From them, they would be the authors of this almost. And could we facilitate commitment from the companies that hire them, pay them, serve them on demand, for example, would be part of that platform, to say there are a set of things we believe are important. One of them could be that you own your own reputation and that it's portable and you could take it to different places. So I think we've thought about a number of things that cross anywhere from how you think about income to the number of companies that pay you, to how your security and safety are important, that I don't think anyone would disagree with being important, and we could find easy solutions to make that happen if we could commit to a common set. That's one thing I would love for us to start at our next event and think about. Is there a common set of things that we could all agree and make happen? There are a lot of standards in the Valley that once a few key companies agree to them, it's really easy to make them law of the land, and we don't require a lot of legislation around them.
That is a really interesting analogy, which is a lot of the software protocols, internet protocols, web protocols, really were figured out by the tech companies, frankly,
Right.
or technologists broader, because it wasn't even always companies. It was open source groups and all kinds of different folks. And that is, it's usually thought of as very techy kind of standards agreement, but it's interesting to think about taking that another notch up and having a standards of treatment of workers, or independent workers, or identity, or reputation systems.
Right.
So I like that framework. So this is it. So Intuit, you're down in the Valley. But in the Bay Area here, frequently moving around. How, and outside of Intuit, I'm sure you interact with a lot of different people from different companies. What's your own personal sense of how open companies and folks will be to that kind of emergent set of standards, or that emergent kind of deal? Just curious, your own sense.
I'm picking between what would be my sense and what would be
Your
my
desire.
hope.
Okay, well, we'll say both. What would be your sense, and then what's the hope?
Yeah, I think today most companies are up for it. And if they're not up for it, they're going to have to be up for it, because the future, you look at the war for talent, is going to be independent talent. And so I don't think we're going to be able to go too long that companies are known for not being a great partner to an independent contractor or freelancer. The companies that don't pay you on time, as platforms proliferate, as there's more opportunities to have companies directly out there. Ernst & Young just announced their own platform where you can come and find gig work for Ernst & Young. There's going to just be
Wait, say more about that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they announced something where you can just think of it as a new age job board, but not just for full-time jobs.
But for them in their company.
Yeah. PricewaterhouseCoopers did one about a year ago, similar thing. And so there are some companies going to platforms to get connected. There are companies who are going to do their own. It makes me wonder, is the job site or the job, page of a company over time going to both be the full-time careers and all of the work that you could do on a freelance capacity? And so I don't think we're going to be able to go too long that companies can't treat this worker with the same level of respect and bring some of the things to bear that would make you a great employer. Small businesses have a huge leg up there right now.
In terms of attracting talent?
In terms of attracting talent in a number of cases. I think, and that's anecdotal, but I think people are open to it, and it's a better experience for the people that you employ, whether they're independent contractors or full-time employees. I recently met a graphic design business here in San Francisco that has a number of full-time employees, but a lot more independent designers, because they need different people with different skills for different jobs. And when they think about their workforce, they don't think about differentiating who are full-time versus part-time. They're all people who deliver their core product, and make their company successful. And I think that's going to have to be the mindset of companies all over the world. Now, everybody won't be there as fast, but as you saw with protocols, the best win. There are opportunities for others to exist in that world.
And then there's a network effect too. Once it starts going, it sets these standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting frame. I mean, it has to do. I mean, we've made reference, partly because you're involved in this project, we're making reference to things that people who are watching this interview might not be fully aware of. But when we talk about this Treaty of Detroit event, what essentially was there was a time in the 1950s where the leading tech companies of that time, the auto industry, essentially set a standard for essentially good middle-class jobs that had health insurance and pensions and vacations and a worker voice and all this. And what we're trying to do here in this event, as you mentioned, is try to figure out what's the comparable situation going forward. And we've got plenty of work we're going to do in that in it coming up here. There's one other thing we've been doing though that's interesting that's related to this last point you just made, is we recently did a virtual roundtable about what could corporations do to evolve their best practices to make it easier to recruit and interconnect with independent workers. And I do think this is something that actually shifts the conversation a little bit, which is we started our own conversation here kind of looking like, oh, these poor independent workers, you know, they don't have stability and they're all hustling all the time. And that is totally true, and there's definitely a huge segment of folks in that space. But there's another portion, particularly the higher end, more skilled end of the independent workers that are in the driver's seat in many respects in terms of the kind of demand they're under, that a lot of companies and corporations are finding it hard to bring in the talent full time. That because those creative types particularly want the flexibility, want the kind of, you know, focus on projects they want, don't like the boss so talk a little bit about the higher end there that I think you're alluding to there, but that I think we haven't spent enough time discussing here. Because there's a lot of positives to being an independent worker.
Yeah.
I mean, setting aside the insecurity stuff, but what have you found when you deal with people in the network of your, the kind of independent workers you're working with in your unit?
Yeah. I think it could be both high-end and work that attracts you. I mean, I think when you talk about, so let me give you examples of both. People love freedom and flexibility. They also love a sure thing and thinking about some consistency. And so I think you will see more companies share more about projects of how long do they think it is and what does it look like? What are the skills required? I think a lot of the listings that you look at Thumbtack do a good job of really explaining what's there. And I think one of the things I hear from people working on that platform is they like pushing into new areas that they haven't spent as much time in. I mean, it's a great way. Smaller gigs are a great way to build skills and expertise. Same thing on the corporate side of it. I think a lot of times it's a good match. We use the platform Catalent, for example. Was formerly Hourly Nerd, and they help source consultants with given expertise to a project. And it's great because for a company, you might need somebody with expertise in South Africa that you don't have readily available. And for a consultant, you've got expertise in South Africa and have lived and worked there. Maybe you're still in South Africa and you can get connected on a project, exchange a bit of what does it look like, get to add a big company to your resume. And so it's a great way to build skills and use your expertise. I mean, it's sort of a win-win for everybody. I think one of the areas companies, large and small, are going to have to think about is the training and skills element. That's one of the things people are looking for. I saw a report, I can't remember who it was from, last week that Steve King covered on his blog that looked at people cycling in and out of independent work, more in white-collar jobs, knowledge work jobs, but specifically to go back and get expertise in companies. And I think there's an opportunity to get training and build expertise without having to go back and get a traditional job. But to do that, we'll have to do a better job of advertising more than just the type of money you might make, but the type of skills or expertise that you could gain. So training in general is an area I think we're going to have to think about to both training people of what they'll need in this new world, but also once you're in it, beyond some of the basics, how do you continue to get what was often offered by your company in terms of leadership development and, you know, basic skills, if it was, you know, coding skills, whatever it might be. But that's an area where when that burden shifts to you, it's harder to find the money and time to prioritize getting some of that expertise if it's not directly relatable or needed right away.
Well, now I'm going to shift direction a little bit here because I understand you're one of the global co-chairs of the Intuit Women's Network. And I did want to just open up this space about how women, in terms of this independent worker space, are there any particular, you know, for example, do women want more flexibility? There's a lot of the issues around raising families or flexibility, or is there anything that's particular to the women's perspective in this thing that you just want to bring up in terms of that field?
Good question. Good research on your part. A few different things I'd bring up about women in self-employment. There are some areas that are true of anybody working for themselves that are particularly great for women. And so freedom and flexibility for any parent is great. It gives you the time to spend with your kid that means a lot to them, or is around the hours of school time. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, talk about a world built for the traditional job, or maybe someone not working as, you know, school hours when you think about getting to an early pickup or volunteering at the fall festival. So flexibility and freedom for women is great. More income. I mean, there are a lot of women. I just met a gaggle of women who are all Stella and Dot sellers. And in most cases, all of them started selling jewelry. Think of it as the jewelry of Amway type model of direct selling. You don't have to own your inventory. You know, for 5 minutes and $5, basically, you can get started selling and connecting people, and it's a great way to earn more income at the point that you don't quite want a job. And so I think just picking the hours that you want and finding another income source that you didn't have is a great motivator for women. There are a lot of women who would also tell you that being their own boss was the #1 way they broke through the glass ceiling, because it's gone now, and there's no one that there's no one to blame except for yourself. And so I've met a lot of independent business owners and a lot of female small business owners that, you know, their story started that they couldn't quite get the opportunities given to them that they were pushing for, and then they decided I'll find them myself and own my own destiny. And there's a lot of empowerment there, and a lot of communities of women, independent contractors and small business owners that have really united to make something bigger that I'm really excited about.
That's interesting. There's also the global piece of that, and I do know you guys have been expanding into other countries. We've kind of by default been talking a little bit more just with the backdrop of the United States here, but do you see any differences as you kind of look into different regions and as you folks start setting up shop in different regions of the world? Talk a little bit about the global piece of the dimension here.
Yeah, I think not everybody makes it country-wise. It's different challenges in different markets. Not everybody makes it as hard as the United States, that's for sure.
It's hard to be an independent worker. Really?
Well,
so say more about that.
Think about any of the social structures that might be in place in terms of what healthcare and maternity leave might look like in Norway versus the United States. You know, I think for women, one of the worries about being an independent contractor and working for yourself is you don't get maternity leave, some of the benefits that a company might offer you beyond what the state mandates aren't necessarily there, and so it's a little harder. And it's not to say it's not impossible, it just requires a lot more on you to save up that money and be putting it away. But I think as you look across different countries around the world, some of the safety nets look a little different. Some of the even some of the norms look a little different in terms of when you would be working versus always on. I don't know if I'd necessarily call out a number of, any one country that looks like they've got all of the things working perfectly. I think that's actually one of the opportunities to look at different protections, different regulations that make it easier or harder, and finding the best of all to find ways to protect this new workforce, because it's not happening just in the United States, it's happening around the world.
Totally is. I mean, although, say more about that. I mean, because it's weird. Some places have always had a more independent worker structure and didn't even, developing world and all kinds of places like that, that the full-time job thing doesn't work. Then you talk about Europe, which had a very different full-time work environment, but subsidized or undergirded by a very social welfare state. But so do you see, but across all of these, are you seeing the kind of independent worker as a growth space, or a space that's increasingly kind of becoming more prominent?
Generally, yes.
Okay.
It depends. In some countries, it's going a lot faster. So we're in the United Kingdom. Self-employment is on a tear in terms of more people becoming self-employed, and some of that is, the population of the workforce that wants more flexibility. It's the proliferation of technology to make it a lot easier. It's unemployment rates. I mean, there are a number of things that make it. There are a number of benefits to being self-employed and live in large in the United Kingdom. Australia is seeing a big boom in self-employment. It's happening in different pockets. In Spain, a lot of it is due to unemployment. And so I think you'd find an increasing number of independent workers, but probably a number of workers who would say they wished they could have more of that stability with a job, and they're doing it out of necessity versus out of deciding for themselves that it's the best move. So you're seeing it happen across the world. A lot of it also driven by the companies employing people are increasingly employing a smaller amount of employees versus bringing in different independent labor. So
now, do you find, is there a generational component to this? I'm just curious, do you find younger people more attracted essentially to the independent work, or forced to be in it because of, let's say, hiring opportunities in Spain and things like that? I'm just curious, what's the generational lens on this?
Every time I want to answer that and say, yes, millennials like independent work more, I meet a person who's retired and over 65 who explains why it's the best way to go into your golden years and finally create the business you wanted, or find ways to meet people. So I think we're seeing it across the board. But people of all ages want great work that uses their skills, that provides value. And I think the more we're thinking about that work being meaningful both for employees and independent contractors and freelancers will be really important. I'd love to see a world where we get to being your own boss is just as good as working for somebody else, if not 10 times better, because it affords you a lot of things that your job will never give you in terms of freedom and flexibility and the passion of what you want to be doing. But we've got a lot of work to do to get rid of the instability to make that happen.
So you mentioned to me that you've been working at Intuit for about a decade, but I understand you also have a little Etsy business or something. Is that right?
I do.
So tell me a little bit about that, because there you've got a finger in this sharing economy world. I'd just be curious. What do you do in that space?
Again, good research. I started an Etsy shop, I think must be more than 5 years ago. I've got a 5-year-old daughter. I wasn't crazy to start when I had her, so maybe 7 years ago. I opened an Etsy store that basically it lets you take a small sweatsuit and turn it into a Halloween costume. So you buy from me a kit of maybe a shark fin and shark teeth that allow you to turn a little gray sweatsuit into a shark costume. So I've got DIY costumes, which are kits, and I'm hoping to move into patterns so I don't have to create all the kits. And I started it out of a passion of mine to help people create. We have a lost art of sewing and cooking. I just saw a New York Times article that said less than 10% of the population wants to cook, which made me sad. So I wanted to create something to help other people create. And a lot of people, sewing is very scary. And so I created a shop that gives you the simple tools to, even if you had 0 sewing skills. I marketed one of the things would take you 15 minutes, and I'll send you the supplies that you need it. And for me, it was a great way to also live and see how easy it is to start selling online. I had a store full of beautiful pictures of things you could buy from me and absolutely no inventory. I hadn't made any of the inventory. I had just made the kits to take photos of. And you can get started. And then you can find out, as it turns out, if I had decided to make all of that inventory, I would have found out that sharks, sell 10 to 1 of a puppy or a turtle or a cow. And so it's a great way to, it's easy to get up and running. And it also makes you realize the number one thing you worried about, I say this from a company that helps you deal with your finances, is going to get customers. You're not worried about counting your money until you're worried about making your money. And so it was a great experience.
So do you have a little market there? I mean, it's working?
I do.
And this must be your boom time if it's coming up on
I also
Halloween,
have a
right?
job and a kid. And so this year I'm not, I've agreed to do, 10 or 15, where usually I'll do 100 in a season. In a season. And all creatures, and 10% goes to animal conservation. So it's been a fun passion project of mine.
And what have you learned through that experience? Because that is a classic, because on one level you're a high-powered corporate exec, and on the other hand you're out there doing your own little business. So any interesting insights you had through that you might not have gotten from reading the reports or talking to people?
The number one has been that all you want to do is the reason you've started your business. That's all I wanted to focus on, was creating kits and talking to people about how to make them and making videos about making kits. I mean, all in that passion space. And there are a lot of things when you're trying to work for yourself that take up your time. Figuring out things like shipping, although I had a husband who could become my chief shipping officer. Things like marketing your business, things like writing copy to go with your product. I mean, there's a lot of things that have the business of having a business that I did not enjoy. Even in things that in my day job I do a lot of, when it came to my business, I didn't want to spend the time on that. And so I can appreciate software tools that get rid of all that stuff so you can focus on what you care about.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So because we're certainly it's a burgeoning world out there. So I guess what you're kind of pointing towards is we've touched on a lot of the positives of running your own business. We've also touched on a lot of difficulties. So when you look out, again, it's the future of work here. When you look out in the next 5-10 years, I mean, how do you feel about what's ahead of us here? Do you feel optimistic that things are building in a positive direction? Are you worried? Are you feeling concerned? I'm just curious. What's your sense of where we're heading into here?
I'm conflicted. I'm an optimist at heart, and so I'm always glass half full, and I believe that there are a lot of things we can do to make work, whether you work for yourself or work for somebody else, equally awesome. I think we've got a lot of work to do. And so the reason I say I'm conflicted is I think we have not yet made the type of progress to recognize this world we've created that's built for traditional work. And so to be at a point that 1/3 of our workforce here in the United States, for example, doesn't fit that model, and then we've got rigid systems that box them out, we've got some work to do. We've definitely got some work to do.
Although it's interesting, again, as part of this project, we've been kind of seeing often analogies to history and all that kind of stuff. It's worth remembering that really the 9 to 5, 40-hour week, or, for a lot of folks, professionals, 50 or 60-hour week, but still constrained by a job, is a relatively recent and temporary space project that actually independent workers is kind of the way the world has worked for all the time, centuries really, and that it was this kind of weird aberration. And I think if we really look back on this someday, it might actually be seen as that was a kind of an odd industrial era model that was worked, and it was all good about that level, but that honestly, it's not optimal for a world that's constantly connected, globally interconnected, fully digital kind of world that we're basically clearly heading into. So it's a kind of there's still a lot of transition, a lot of difficulties, but I think in the long run, it feels almost weirdly, and I think people lose track of this, that it's actually kind of going back to the norm of how creative, innovative individuals working in the world will actually best thrive. I mean, honestly, it feels to me like ultimately the long-term vision is the right direction, as opposed to the one that, oh my God, can we only stick in those jobs? I mean, there's so many people hate their jobs today too. That's the other thing that's actually kind of interesting about it is people, it's for all the longing for the old jobs. A lot of people don't. It's not exactly the final place to rest.
I totally agree with you. And I think that one of the things that gives me optimism is humans are resourceful, innovative, creative forces. And I think where we can meet that force with some technology to connect them better and make it easier will make life easier. But the world's going this way or not. And to your point, we've done this before. And who liked this world where work happened in these constrained ways? As a working mom, I hate it. and I work for a company. I've only been in a company for a decade because I don't have to conform to it exactly. But I think every time we cry over the traditional 40-hour-a-week job, I roll my eyes and think, nobody liked that anyway, in a number of cases. People want to do great work with people that they enjoy working with, and we can make that happen in lots of different forms.
So your daughter's what, five-year-old daughter? Someday she's going to look back and go, Mom, you worked in one job.
I know.
At only one place that you had to go down to all the time? It'll be kind of one of those things.
I know.
We'll see.
My grandmother just turned 95, and we were comparing the difference of my grandfather's job, who retired with a gold watch, and the idea that my daughter won't even look for a job. She'll have a number of new skills. She probably will open an Etsy shop in the next 2 years.
And the AI will sell her products. She won't.
Good.
Anyhow, that seems like a good place to end on the future of work. And thanks so much for joining us and
Thanks for having me.
and passing on all what you know. Thanks.